So imagine a document signed by the president instructing federal law enforcement to investigate, disrupt, and potentially prosecute not just violent actors, but entire networks, organizations, and even ordinary citizens based on what they think, say, or support. A document that singles out an ideological movement called Antifa, labels it as a threat, and defines its members' beliefs as warning signs for domestic terrorism. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This is NSPM-7, the National Security Presidential Memorandum on Countering Domestic Terrorism and Organized Political Violence. And if you think that sounds like something out of a dystopian novel, think again. This memo is 100% real, and it's now a blueprint for how the federal government may investigate political violence in ways that collide with fundamental rights. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another supplemental installment of Back Porch Files from Your Neighbor on the Left, a podcast about liberal politics, human decency, and life on the blue side of America's ideological divide. My name is Don Spielis, your opinionated host. I want to talk to you about the National Security Presidential Memorandum on Countering Domestic Terrorism and Organized Political Violence, otherwise known as NSPM-7. It's particularly relevant given all the imaginary chaos in places like Portland and Chicago, thanks to the false narrative coming from the White House, specifically Stephen Miller and the president himself. I want to break this down in a way that will shed some light on the misleading or outright false information that is being put out there, and explain why this new document from the current administration is not just troubling, but potentially dangerous. NSPM-7 opens with a very dramatic framing. Assassinations, riots, and violence increasing dramatically, punctuated by references to high-profile incidents. But immediately the language signals a serious problem. The memo consistently frames the threat through the lens of so-called anti-fascism. It paints this movement as inherently violent, a danger to democracy, and a justification for federal intervention. Now, here's the first thing to note. The memo conflates anti-fascism with political violence in a way that is misleading, historically and ideologically. Fascism, as a political movement, is traditionally associated with far-right authoritarianism. The same kinds of ideologies, according to experts, the administration itself often exhibits in policy and rhetoric. Antifa, or anti-fascist activism, is largely a decentralized set of groups opposed to far-right extremism, not a top-down organization committing coordinated acts of terror. NSPM-7, however, repeatedly casts anti-fascism as the organizing principle behind domestic terrorism. That's not just an error in terminology. It's a political framing that sets the stage for targeting an ideological opposition. The memo also describes a pattern, quote, recurrent motivations, end quote, including anti-Americanism, anti-capitalism, anti-Christianity, extremism on migration, race, and gender, and hostility towards traditional views on family and morality. The danger here isn't just factual inaccuracy, it's the memorandum strategy to take protected political speech, dissent, or activism and label it as a potential precursor to violent action. That sets up a chilling effect for anyone participating in protest movements, advocacy, or organizing. Never mind the fact that the things that it mentions, morality, traditional views, Americanism, are at best nebulous concepts that can be defined in many differing ways. So let's talk about how investigations could expand. In Section 2 of NSPM-7, it empowers the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, the Department of Justice, the Treasury, the IRS, and other agencies to investigate, disrupt, and prosecute political violence. The language goes far beyond investigating actual criminal acts. It authorizes inquiries into funders, officers, employees of organizations allegedly tied to violence, nonprofits or tax-exempt entities, including those operating abroad or with foreign connections, behaviors, fact patterns, and recurrent motivations, essentially ideological markers. This is a significant expansion of federal authority. Investigators are instructed to prioritize certain statutes, including conspiracy against rights, solicitation of violence, money laundering, RICO statutes, and terrorist funding laws. That all sounds serious, and it is, but the memo instructs law enforcement to link these statutes not only to actual crimes, but to networks, ideological patterns, and associations. They use a phrase called pre-adjudication questioning, which is particularly troubling. Federal law enforcement is asked to question individuals about the organizations or networks behind actions even before any formal charges or plea agreements. This raises obvious due process concerns. It's a framework where suspicion can justify investigation, where associational and ideological markers might be treated as risk factors. In other words, you don't have to commit a crime to be scrutinized under this directive. The memo also provides for designating organizations as domestic terrorist organizations, something the Attorney General can recommend directly to the President. Unlike foreign terrorist designations, this carries no clear statutory basis, no established judicial review, and no procedural protections. Historically, the U.S. government has only designated foreign entities under strict legal frameworks. Applying this domestically raises serious constitutional red flags. The First Amendment, labeling groups based on ideology or political belief as terrorists, risks punishing protected speech and association. The Fifth Amendment, designation without due process could freeze assets, hinder organizational operations, and stigmatize members. And then administrative law, the lack of clear statutory authority creates ambiguity about how the designation can be applied, an area where ambiguity is the last thing that's appropriate. In practice, this could mean that any loosely affiliated activist organization or even a nonprofit that opposes government policy could be targeted, surveilled, or financially constrained. NSPM-7 makes domestic terrorism a national priority area and directs federal grant money to be allocated to state, local, and tribal law enforcement partners to detect and prevent these threats. The implication is clear. Agencies and departments that want federal funding may be incentivized to adopt the memo's broad ideological definitions of terrorism. That creates the potential for selective enforcement, where political priorities influence law enforcement focus. It's a subtle form of pressure, but it's one with real consequences. Now, taken all together, the memo has several areas of potential conflict with law and the Constitution. Free speech and association, defining radicalization and recurrent motivations as part of domestic terrorism, could target political activists, advocacy groups, and citizens simply for their beliefs. Due process, investigations and designations without clear procedural safeguards raise questions under the 5th and 14th Amendments. Think about all of the arguments about due process we've had this year in regards to illegal immigrants. Imagine them applied to folks targeted under the guidelines of this memo. Then there's privacy and surveillance. Coordination between DOJ, Treasury, IRS, and intelligence agencies may allow for aggregation of personal data based on ideology or association, which, of course, creates Fourth Amendment concerns. So imagine being on a target list because of voting Democrat or attending a 50-51 protest. There's the concepts of federalism and coercion. Using federal grants as leverage for enforcement priorities could pressure local police and agencies to implement politically aligned policies. There are vague standards in this memo, terms like anti-Americanism, hostility towards traditional views, and support for overthrowing the government. They are dangerously subjective. Vague definitions can lead to selective or outright arbitrary enforcement. These implications are not theoretical. If implemented aggressively, NSPM-7 could reshape the federal government's approach to political activism, protests, and advocacy in ways never seen before in modern U.S. history. And let's return back to the whole misuse of fascism in the memo. A core issue, and one that can't be ignored, is the memo's distortion of political terminology. It repeatedly frames Antifa, a largely decentralized anti-fascist movement, as the embodiment of domestic terrorism. In reality, the administration's own rhetoric and some policies align more closely with authoritarian far-right tendencies historically associated with fascism. By inverting the term, NSPM-7 positions anti-fascist movements as enemies while effectively leaving authoritarian-leaning actors unexamined. For listeners, this is more than a semantic issue. Okay, it's not just quibbling over terms. It's a strategy to redirect enforcement resources and public attention towards ideological opponents rather than actual sources of authoritarian risk. Not to mention the fact that folks like the president and Stephen Miller and others use the word fascist when referring to far-left protesters and activists. They're essentially calling the anti-fascists fascists. Okay, so what does all this mean? The memo, if acted on, could chill political speech and activism as people fear scrutiny or designation, encourage surveillance of ordinary Americans based on their ideology, their thoughts, rather than any criminal conduct, provide a framework for federal pressure on state and local enforcement to prioritize politically defined threats, set a precedent for using broad ideological coded criteria to justify investigative and prosecutorial measures. For citizens, activists, and organizations, this raises the question, when does protecting public safety cross into suppressing dissent? NSPM-7 doesn't give any answers. It provides authority, sweeping, open-ended authority, with vague guidance on its limits. And I can't help but keep coming back to the idea that many of the supposed criteria that are mentioned are things that are not specifically defined in the memo, let alone out of the memo, and could be judged by many different people in many different ways. NSPM-7 is more than a policy memo. It is a blueprint for how the federal government could target political activity under the guise of domestic terrorism. Its language conflates ideology with criminality. Its provisions expand investigatory powers without clear guidelines, and its designations could impose real consequences on organizations and individuals without due process and without there having ever been a crime actually committed. For Americans concerned about civil liberties, freedom of speech, and political participation, all very prominent ideas, particularly in 2025, this memo should be alarming. Its focus on anti-fascism as a domestic terror threat demonstrates the dangers of political framing and highlights the potential for abuse in law enforcement and surveillance. And while it claims to protect democracy, it could just as easily undermine it. So here's the takeaway. NSPM-7 is not just about stopping violence. It's about defining who counts as a threat and what ideology puts you under scrutiny. The memo shows the federal government is willing to use broad ideological coded criteria to justify surveillance, investigation, and disruption, raising questions that go straight to the core of the Constitution. The debate is not hypothetical anymore. It's happening now, and it's worth paying attention to. Okay, so as I bring this episode of Back Porch Files to a close, I just want to mention that I have a copy of NSPM-7 that's annotated with some of the troubling areas highlighted, and I'm going to post that. It's in PDF format. I'm going to post it to the podcast Linktree page in case you want to take a look at it. I want to thank everyone for taking the time to listen to this episode. As always, I want to hear from any of you, whether you agree or disagree, whether you have suggestions or critiques, whatever it is, I'd like to hear from you. You can reach out to me via any of the social media platforms for the podcast. All of those are listed on the Linktree page, and the Linktree page address is in the podcast description. We'll be back on Tuesday with another full episode of Your Neighbor on the Left. So until then, stay vigilant, stay kind, and as always, have the week you'd wish for others.